This is the TEEVOLUTIon Terra, one of the most anticipated releases of 2025, as the Terra is a reimagining of the legendary Logitech G703, which has sadly been abandoned by Logitech. So TEEVOLUTIon took it upon themselves to make a modern version with some slight changes and improvements and of course some modern specs. Now many of you probably don't know who TEEVOLUTIon is, and I don't blame you, as they actually used to be a Fantech sub-brand, but now they are a sister brand to Fantech. And while they previously released some of Fantech's mice, the Terra is their first official release, and one that significantly improves upon what Fantech has done with their previous releases. So in today's video, we're going to talk in depth about the TEEVOLUTIon Terra and go over the mouse's pros and cons, and see if this mouse can live up to the hype in today's episode of the mel0n Review. But before we get into it, a big thank you to TEEVOLUTIon, who was kind enough to send over the Terra 4 review. I greatly appreciate it. As always, if you enjoyed the review, be sure to leave a like on this video and get subscribed to the channel so you don't miss any future reviews like this, and of course the Terra's teardown video. And if you'd like to support what I do here on the channel, consider becoming a channel member or using my affiliate codes which are linked down in the video description. But without further ado, let's get right into today's episode of the mel0n Review. For testing parameters, I used the Terra for approximately 3 weeks, daily driving the mouse for both work and gaming use. For skates I tested all the included skate types as well as the Obsidian Air dots over my testing, and for sensitivity I used my usual range of 40cm per 360 for soft pads and 50cm per 360 for hard pads. For pricing and versions, the Terra is available in two types. The Terra Pro 8K Ready, which retails for $78.80 USD, but this doesn't include the 8K dongle, so if you want to utilize the mouse's high polling rates, you'll have to purchase the 8K dongle separately for an additional $29.80 USD. And then we have the Terra Pro 8K Included, which retails for $105.80 USD and includes the 8K Hz Dongle. Now, admittedly, this Terra Pro 8K Ready and Terra Pro 8K Included naming is kind of confusing. I'd much rather see the 8K Ready version just be called the Terra and the 8K Included version called the Terra Pro, as it'd be easier for customers to differentiate the two models with a clearer naming convention. As of this review, both versions of the Terra are available in both black and white colorways. I assume we'll see some additional colorways in the future, but for now we just have white and black, and today I'll be covering the Terra Pro 8K Included in the black colorway. For unboxing, both versions of the Terra have similar unboxing experiences. The only main difference between them is that one includes the 8K dongle and one doesn't, but if you purchase the Terra from TEEVOLUTIon's Indiegogo campaign and were an early backer, your mouse will include some extras the retail versions won't include. Now, starting off with the packaging, the mouse comes in a fairly standard box which does list the mouse's specs and dimensions on it, which is nice to see, and one cool little feature is that the box color will change depending on what colorway you get, and since I have the black version of the Terra, I have the black box design. Inside we have the mouse itself, which is wrapped in a plastic wrapper, but unlike most mice, the Terra comes with these very unique honeycomb skates pre-installed, and these skates are interesting to say the least, and we'll talk a little bit more about why these are so unique later in this video. Under the mouse we have a small accessory package which includes a USB A to C cable, a rather familiar one at that, as this is actually the exact same cable type we saw included with the Fantech Aria 2 Pro, which admittedly is disappointing as the cable shares the same issues as that one did when it comes to wired use, but we'll talk more about this later. Also included are two extra types of skates, a full-size PTFE version and a set of 8 dot skates. These are 100% PTFE skates just like the stock honeycomb ones, and unsurprisingly they're very similar to the ones we've seen included with Fantech's mice, with the exception of the honeycomb skates of course due to their texturing, but we'll go over these skates in more detail later in this video. We also have a full-size set of grip tapes which, unlike the ones we've seen with Fantech's mice, are quite good, which is great to see included. And lastly, we have a USB-A dongle, which the Terra is paired to by default on both versions, a set of TEEVOLUTIon stickers, a full multi-language user manual, and a collector card, of which there are 6 types: common green, a rare silver, and an ultra rare gold. These cards serve not only as a cool little collectible included with the Terra, they also serve as digital discount vouchers you can use on TEEVOLUTIon's site, but you'll need to claim the discount manually, and to do this, you'll need to follow the instructions that TEEVOLUTION will post on their site in the future. Now, as I mentioned earlier, if you purchase the Terra from TEEVOLUTION's Indiegogo campaign and were an early backer, you'll also receive this special Genesis pack, which includes 16 black PTFE dots. These are the exact same shape and type as the ones that were included with the mouse, they've just been dyed black, a 10% off coupon, and a special set of grip tapes with some unique designs applied to them. But sadly, while these designs look cool, they significantly reduce the gripability of the grips. So even though these Genesis grips are the exact same type as the ones that are included with the Terra, these Genesis versions are much worse in my opinion, which is disappointing to see. But again, this package and these grips are only included for early backers of the Terra. And lastly, in terms of warranty coverage, the Terra comes with the standard 1-year warranty, which will be facilitated through TEEVOLUTION. Next up, I wanted to quickly talk about the Terra's AK dongle, as it's quite unique opposed to a lot of the other AK dongles we see on the market. Now, we've seen mice use dongles with displays on them before, the most notable being Vancer's mice, but TEEVOLUTION's take on a display dongle is much better implemented and is arguably the best implementation I've seen to date. Now, the display on the dongle has 2 modes which you can toggle between by double tapping the button on the side of the dongle. The first mode is the default overview mode, which displays the mouse's battery, connectivity status, DPI, LOD, report rate, and more. The second mode is the clock mode, which displays your system's time and date in a 24-hour format, as well as the mouse's battery level and connectivity status. But since the dongle mirrors your system time, there's no way to alter the time on the dongle itself, and there's also no way to swap it to a 12-hour format, which is a little disappointing. You can also increase or decrease the screen's brightness by tapping the button on the side, and if you don't want the dongle to display anything, you can hold the side button for around 3 seconds to disable the display, and to re-enable it you can do the same thing, but to be clear, the dongle will still function even if the display is turned off. Another nice attention to detail is that the dongle has a very large rubber foot on its base, and combined with the dongle's weight, it anchors itself quite well to desks, even with the mouse's heavier stock cable. Now, aside from not being able to change the dongle's time to 12-hour or adjust the time on the dongle itself, not on your system, my only other gripe about the dongle is that the screen is plastic, and if you wipe it with a microfiber cloth or any other type of cloth for that matter, the screen gets covered in micro scratches very easily, and for this reason I would have loved to see the dongle have a glass screen, as while that would have increased the price of the unit, it would have made it much more durable. And just to reiterate, as I mentioned earlier, by default both versions of the Terra will be bound to the included 1K Hz dongle. You'll need to manually connect the mouse to the 8K Hz dongle, which is quite easy to do, and we'll go over that process later in this video. Alright, next let's talk about the Terra's in-game performance. Now, those of you who have watched the channel for a long time know I love ergo mice, but I've never actually used the original G703. I have used a smaller version of its shape in the form of the PM1, which I really did enjoy using, and since the Terra is just a larger version of a PM1 in many ways, with some notable improvements, needless to say I really enjoyed using the Terra, and for this being TEEVOLUTION's first mouse, I'm very impressed. Now, as always, I'll talk in depth about all the aspects of the mouse in this video, but I wanted to highlight a couple things here. Firstly, the mouse's shape is amazing, definitely one of the most comfortable shapes I've used in 2025 so far, and the shell has a great coating applied to it too. I did have one area where the coating wasn't applied properly, but aside from that small area, the coating was fantastic and performed extremely well over my testing. The mouse's buttons are also a standout in my opinion, specifically the side buttons, as they're the largest side buttons I've ever seen on a mouse to date, but despite their really large size, they're actually very comfortable to use and they feel great. The main clicks are also fantastic, as they're using the same FE optical switches that we saw on the Pulsar X2 Crazy Light, which are one of my favorite switch types as they feel very similar to mel0n opticals and have a great tactile feel and sound to them. The mouse's stock skates, as I mentioned earlier, are also interesting, specifically the honeycomb ones, and while the honeycomb ones aren't my personal favorite skate, the included full-size and dot skates were much better and did perform quite well over my testing, and arguably most importantly, the mouse's performance specs are absolutely stellar from my testing, and the mouse performed on par with all the other high-end gaming mice that are available on the market and the ones I've personally tested, and all this combined with a fantastic shape makes the Terra an incredibly solid all-around mouse, one that performed amazingly in every game I tested. But despite this, I did have some nitpicks with this mouse, as there are some areas that are a little lacking unfortunately, mainly the battery, the scroll wheel, and some aspects of the unit's build quality are a little lacking in my opinion, but despite these issues, the Terra is still overall a very solid mouse and a fantastic first release from TEEVOLUTION. In terms of build quality and QC, as I just mentioned, the Terra is overall very impressive, but there are some small issues I wanted to highlight with my unit. Firstly, on the right side of my mouse, there is a small section of the coating that didn't adhere properly, causing it to bubble and break, causing a noticeable dead zone, so to speak, in the coating. Now, this appears to be isolated to my unit, and it doesn't impact the usability of the mouse at all, but it's something that absolutely should have been caught during QC. The other and less obvious issue I have on my unit is that one of the base screws was stripped out of the box, and upon closer inspection, this appeared to be caused by the screw being over-tensioned by the factory, splitting the pilot holes in the framing. Now, this is an easy fix, as TEEVOLUTION can simply update the pilot holes to be metal instead of plastic, and hopefully we'll see this fix applied to their future units, as I actually managed to snap another one of the pilot holes when I reassembled the mouse after taking photos of the internals. But aside from those two issues, the build quality and QC on the rest of the Terra is fantastic, and even with the two loose screws on the base, there is no significant creaking or flexing anywhere else in the mouse's shell, and the mouse's buttons are perfectly implemented, specifically the side buttons due to their larger size. They could use a little less post travel, but we'll talk more about that later. And one last really impressive aspect to the Terra is that its internal build quality is fantastic, and it's using a unique PCB layout I've only seen on a handful of mice to date, where the main clicks and scroll wheel are on a separate PCB just like the side buttons, and they're connected to the main board via a ribbon cable. Now, previously I haven't really been a fan of this design, as brands tend to make the ribbon cables for these daughter boards extremely short, so reassembling the mouse is really difficult, but TEEVOLUTION made these cables very long, so the Terra is very easy to service, which is a great thing to see. Another area where TEEVOLUTION has done a great job here with the Terra is weight, as instead of falling into the ultralight pitfall that many brands have fallen into lately, they decided to go for a more realistic weight spec for a mouse of this size while maintaining solid build quality. Now, TEEVOLUTION is advertising that the Terra weighs 49 plus minus 2 grams, but sadly the unit's true weight is actually slightly outside of this spec. Now, my unit with its stock honeycomb skates or the full-size PTFE skates weighs exactly 51.3 grams, with the included 8 dot skates, the mouse weighs 50.7 grams, and without any skates, the mouse weighs 50 grams. Now, while my Terra is only 0.3 grams outside the advertised weight spec, I still think that TEEVOLUTION should update the mouse's weight spec to be 50 plus minus 2 grams. That way, regardless of what skate you use, the mouse will be within its advertised weight spec. But aside from this slightly inaccurate weight spec here, the true weight of the Terra is fantastic, especially considering the size of the mouse. In all honesty, I was expecting this mouse to weigh more around the 60 gram range, but 51.3 grams is a welcome surprise and a completely fine weight for a mouse of this size and one with this build quality. And when it comes to balancing, as expected, the Terra is centrally balanced, being balanced ever so slightly forward of the mouse's midline, right between where the two side buttons meet and right at the mouse's slightly forward sensor position. But as expected for an ergo mouse, the mouse isn't fully balanced on its y-axis, being slightly left-leaning, but this is a common trait for ergo mice, and the difference is so slight it's not going to impact the mouse's usage or performance, but it might take a couple days to get accustomed to the feel of the mouse's balancing points. Now, shape is where the Terra gets very interesting, as while it's classified as an ergo mouse due to its tilt, the profile of its shell is quite different compared to more traditional ergo mice. But before we talk about that, in terms of dimensions, lengthwise the Terra measures 124.7 millimeters. For width, at the front of the shell the mouse measures approximately 64.4 millimeters wide, at its middle it measures 62.3 millimeters wide, and at the most pronounced point of the rear shell, the mouse measures 65.3 millimeters wide. For heights, at the very front of the shell the mouse measures 21.1 millimeters tall, but keep in mind that the left side of the shell will be taller and the right side will be shorter due to the mouse's tilt. At the midpoint of the mouse's shell, right at the termination point of the hump, the mouse measures 42.3 millimeters tall, and towards the rear of the mouse, the shell measures approximately 19.6 millimeters tall. Now, the Terra's shape is obviously an ergonomic shape, as I mentioned earlier, right hand optimized as expected, but since it is an ergo shape, you cannot use this mouse if you are left-handed. But as I mentioned earlier, what makes the Terra's shape so unique is that unlike many other ergo mice, such as the Razer Death Adder V3 for example, the mouse's shell is more pronounced towards the upper right side, and the rear curvature of the shell is thinner and taller, creating a higher, more rounded hump than you commonly see on many ergo mice, hence why the Terra in the hand feels a little different from the more traditionally shaped ergo mice. And in terms of the Terra's shell profiles, from the top we can see the aforementioned unique ergo shell shape with the more pronounced upper right side and slightly thinner rear rounded hump design. Flipping the unit over and looking at the mouse from the base, we can again see the unique shape, but we can also see that the base is slightly thinner than the top shell, and to account for this, the base shell flares out slightly to match the top shell's size. From here we can also see the left side of the mouse's right side from the top has a very expressed hourglass-like indentation into it, one that takes up a significant portion of the mouse's side profile. From the sides we can best see the ergo-like shape of the Terra again, and we can get a good look at the massive side buttons, which as I mentioned earlier I'm a very big fan of. Now the upper shell curvature here reminds me a lot of the top shell profile of the GPX, as it's a taller, more consistent rounded curvature than most mice, and just like the GPX, the peak of the Terra's top shell terminates right at the mouse's midline. From the front we can see the expected ergo tilt to the Terra's shell, being taller towards the left side of the shell, right from the front, and shorter towards the right side of the mouse, left from the front, and we can see that the sides of the Terra aren't even, as the right side, the left from the front, is a flattened design which is slightly outwardly tilted, which remains largely flat along the side shell profile, but the left side, right from the front, is flattish, but it's inwardly tilted and it curves inward towards the midline of the mouse, creating that heavy hourglass indentation we talked about earlier. And lastly, from the rear of the mouse, we can again see the tilt to the mouse's shell. Admittedly, it's less noticeable towards the rear of the shell than it was towards the front of the shell, but it's still visible, and we can best see the curvature of the mouse's hump, which is a higher rounded type, again being very reminiscent of the GPX in terms of its profile. In terms of contact areas, for my 1905 by 12.7 centimeter hands using a tilted claw grip here on the Terra, my primary contact points are my mid to low thenar, my high mid palm, and my mid to low hypothenar. But due to the unique shell shape, the mid palm contact here isn't centered as usual, as instead it leans more towards the right side of my hand, which is unique to the Terra. For finger contact, my thumb naturally rests at the very top of the Terra's left side, but I can easily curve my thumb in and comfortably place it at the center of the left side's indentation. My index and middle fingers rest towards the end of the main clicks right in the center, and my ring and pinky finger rest towards the front of the Terra's right side, but just like the thumb, I can naturally shift that down towards the middle of the mouse to have a more centered grip style. Now, according to TEEVOLUTION, they're advertising that the Terra will be well suited for palm grips and claw grips, but they don't specify hand size or any additional details in terms of hand and grip style compatibility. But seeing as the Terra is a ergonomic mouse and a larger one at that, the mouse's hand and grip style compatibility will vary significantly depending on your hand size. Now, for small hands measuring approximately 11.7 by 7.5 centimeters, the mouse will be best suited for palm grips, but the mouse might be too small for some smaller hands due to its size. For small to medium hands measuring approximately 13.5 by 9 centimeters, the mouse will again be best suited for palm grips. For medium hands measuring around 15 by 10 centimeters, the mouse will be best suited for palm and claw grips. For medium to large hands measuring approximately 16 by 11 centimeters, the mouse will again be best suited for palm and claw grips. And for large hands measuring around 17 by 12 centimeters, the mouse will yet again be best suited for palm and claw grips. And for extra large hands like mine measuring approximately 19 by 13 centimeters, the mouse will be best suited for claw grips. It's also worth noting that medium to large, and extra large hand sizes can fingertip grip the Terra, but since the mouse is that larger ergonomic shape, fingertip grip isn't necessarily ideal with some hand sizes. Now, as I mentioned earlier in this video, the Terra's coating is one aspect where TEEVOLUTION did a fantastic job, and over my testing the coating has performed exceptionally well, but it does have its quirks. Now, the coating itself feels identical to the coatings we saw in the Pulsar X2 V2 and the Phantek Aria 2 Pro, with some ever so slight differences, as the Terra's coating leans slightly more on the rubberized side than chalky, but despite this, the coating is not only great for dry hands, it's also great for sweatier hands like mine, and over my testing the coating performed so well I didn't find the need to use the included grip tapes or any other kind of grip aids. But just like the X2 V2 and Aria 2 Pro's coating, the coating here on the Terra does pick up dust, debris, and oils from your hand like a magnet, which does cause the mouse to look a little grimy over time. Now, thankfully the coating is easy to clean as you can just wipe it off with a microfiber cloth, but if you're picky about the appearance of your mouse, I'd recommend getting the white colorway, as everything the coating picks up will be much less visible on that colorway. But while the coating performed great as I mentioned earlier, I did have an issue with the coating's application, as it appeared to not have bonded properly, which caused the coating to bubble and crack in a small section on my mouse's left side. Now this never impacted the mouse's usage, and I didn't have any other issues with the coating over my testing, but again, this is something that absolutely should have been caught during the Terra's QC. And as I mentioned earlier, the Terra does include a set of surprisingly good grip tape, which is a welcome change seeing as Fantech's previous mice have included some lackluster grips to say the least. Now the grips only come in a full-size form consisting of 2 click covers and 2 side covers. Sadly, there are no additional pieces included to cover the rear shell of the mouse, but since the coating is so good, this isn't exactly necessary. Now the grips themselves are made out of a softer, sticky rubber material, but they are on the thicker side, measuring around 0.5 millimeters thick, and they do have this unique triangular-like texturing across them, which in combination with the material and the softness makes these grips very grippy. Now to be clear, they're not as grippy as the grips included with say a Wiseowl or a Ponage mouse, but they're still very solid, and the only way I'd improve them would be to include more shapes, such as a tiny universal kit, similar to the ones we saw with Ponage's recent releases, as that give more flexibility to the grip's install, as well as offer more coverage for the mouse's rear shell. But again, because the mouse's coating is so good, I feel like a lot of people aren't going to use their grips, but for people who do want to use them, having some more options for installing them aside from the pre-cut sets would be a welcome change. Now the Terra's main clicks are the typical larger size you'd expect to find on an ergo mouse, but they're much less rounded than most ergo mice's main clicks are, and due to the ergo shell, the main clicks do have different click heights, as the Terra's left click has a click height of approximately 25.5 millimeters, while the right click has a click height of approximately 20.4 millimeters, and both of these click heights were measured at the very end of the shell clicks, but keep in mind as you go up towards the middle of the mouse, the clicks will obviously get much taller. Now both the shell buttons do share the same coating as the rest of the Terra's shell, and both buttons also have a fairly pronounced groove in them that runs from around the end of the click to around the midpoint of the buttons, and in combination with the fantastic coating, the shell buttons are very grippy and the grooves guide your fingers to the center of the shell buttons, which is great to see. The shell buttons are also very well stabilized, one of the better stabilized clicks I've seen as of late, and both the buttons are also indented into the shell, albeit very slightly, but it's enough of an indentation to keep both the main clicks free of any interference issues from your fingers resting on the mouse's sides. In terms of click audio, here's a quick sound test for the main clicks. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the Terra is using the same FE optical switches we saw used on the Pulsar X2 Crazy Light. Personally speaking, I'm really happy to see these switches return here, as they performed exceptionally well on the Crazy Light, and they've done the same here on the Terra, as they feel fantastic. Now, in terms of actuation weight, the main clicks feel average, being around a 5 out of 10, but keep in mind the actuation weight does get slightly heavier towards the middle and the top of the shell buttons. Both the buttons do have a low range of pre-travel and a medium to long range of post-travel, depending on how hard you click the shell buttons in. But despite the longer range of post travel, the main clicks do have a nice snappy rebound, which does make the main clicks decently spammable, but that said, I would still like to see the main clicks post travel be tightened up to the low medium range, as that'd make the buttons feel even snappier, but the current implementation is fine by all means. And lastly, I also wanted to mention that the Terra's main clicks do come with a default 8 millisecond debounce, which is a little odd for an optical switch, as generally speaking they don't need debounce values, so I'd recommend dropping this pre-travel down to 0 to 3 milliseconds, as that was the same range used by the Pulsar X2 Crazy Light's main clicks. And just like the main clicks, the Terra's side clicks are also fantastic, but they're quite unique as I mentioned earlier, as they are the largest side buttons I've ever seen on a mouse to date. It's hard to describe the button shape in all honesty, as they're so different from the pill or chip shaped buttons we've seen on other mice, but despite their unique shaping, the buttons are slightly rounded on their surface, which normally I don't like, but since they're so large, the roundness actually works here on the Terra's side buttons. For positioning, the side buttons are positioned fairly high up in the mouse's side shell, and they're positioned slightly forward of the mouse's midline, same as the mouse's sensor, and the buttons are ever so slightly forward tilted to match the forward shell curvature, but it's worth noting despite their size, I never had any issues with my thumb making contact with the buttons during my testing, so they're positioned out of the way enough where you won't accidentally actuate them with your thumb, but they're also close enough where they're easy to actuate if needed. And yet another fantastic aspect to these side buttons is that they're very pronounced from the mouse's side shell, and they also share the same coating as the main clicks and the rest of of the Terra's shell, and combined with their pronouncements from the shell and their size, the side buttons are not only very easy to grip, but they're also very easy to actuate and very easy to consistently actuate, which is a common flaw in many side buttons. It's also worth noting that despite their larger size, the side buttons are also very well stabilized. There is still a slight wobble to them, but despite this, both the side buttons feel very rigid and consistent when actuated. In terms of click audio, here's a quick sound test for the side buttons. On the inside, the Terra is using the 1.0 black shell white dot switches, which, while being a very overused switch, do fit quite well here, as it gives the side buttons a fairly average actuation weight of around 4.5 out of 10, which gives them a similar enough feeling to the main click, so the unit's buttons do feel balanced. In terms of travel, both the side buttons have a medium range of pre-travel and a longer range of post-travel, but just like the main clicks, they do have a snappy rebound that does make the buttons feel decently spammable. But again, just like I said with the main clicks, I would like to see the side buttons post-travel tightened up a little bit so the buttons felt a little snappier, but again, their current implementation is fine. Now, to be clear, due to the side button's large size, the buttons do tilt slightly when actuated, which normally I criticize, but since these buttons are so large, this is kind of unavoidable, and even with their larger size, they do tilt less than many smaller side button implementations I've seen on other mice, and this tilting never significantly impacts the feel or the performance of the side buttons. Now, the Terra's scroll wheel is a fairly standard implementation, but sadly, unlike many other aspects of this mouse, the scroll wheel could definitely use some improvement. Now, the wheel itself is a plastic wheel with a rubber texturing wrapped around it, and this texturing is a semi-linear rounded texturing, which is grippy and makes actuating the scroll wheel quite easy. The scroll wheel is also decently pronounced from the top shell, but like we see on all ergos, you'll have a larger scroll range scrolling on the right side of the wheel than the left due to the shell's ergo tilt. This isn't by any means a bad thing or something that negatively impacts the mouse's usage, it's just something I wanted to note. Inside, the Terra is using an F-Switch 11S pink encoder, which gives the scroll wheel a scroll force of around 4.5 out of 10 with very slightly pronounced scroll points, but sadly, since the scroll points are so weak, it's very easy to over-scroll the scroll wheel when scroll wheel clicking, which is disappointing to see, and because of this, I'd love to see a stronger encoder with more pronounced scroll points here on a future version of the Terra, as in its current form, the scroll wheel feels a little slippery and hard to control, and it is without a doubt the weakest aspect of the Terra. In terms of the scroll wheel click, the Terra is using a Kale pillar switch with a cyan topper, the same one we saw used on the low free high pace, which has a heavier actuation force of around 6 out of 10 and a weak rebound, so the scroll wheel isn't exactly spammable, but this is to be expected for a pillar switch designed like this. And in terms of sensor, as expected for a 2025 release, the Terra is using the PixArt 3950, just one with a custom naming, the 3950 Strike in this case. Now, the sensor here is a fairly standard 3950 implementation with the expected 750 IPS and 50 gram acceleration ratings and 3 LOD levels of 0.71 and 2 millimeters, but this version has a slightly modified max DPI, having a max DPI of 42,000, not the standard 32,000, which is adjustable via 50 DPI steps. The sensor also supports motion sync, which is enabled by default, angle snapping and ripple, both of which are disabled by default, but can be enabled via the Terra's software. Now, the mouse's sensor isn't centrally positioned as I mentioned earlier, being positioned ever so slightly forward of the mouse's midline. Now, while this is technically a non-stock sensor position, it's only different by a very slight margin, and it isn't different enough to significantly impact the mouse's performance. You might notice that some tracking and flicking does feel a little weird depending on your aim style, but this will only last a short period of time, as the more you use the mouse you'll get accustomed to the slightly different sensor position, and after a little bit of use it will feel one for one with a standard central located sensor position. And in terms of MCU, the Terra is using the tried and true Nordic 52840 MCU, the MCU of choice for most if not all high performance gaming mice. Alright, and seeing as the Terra uses a PixArt 3950 and a Nordic 52840 MCU, as expected this mouse is going to support up to 8K polling on its 2.4 GHz wireless connectivity. On wired though, it is capped to 1 kHz, which is very disappointing, and on its Bluetooth connectivity it does cap the report rate to 125 Hz as usual. Now, given the mouse's price point, I understand why they didn't do a dual chip designed to have 8K over the wired connectivity, but this is something I would love to see added on a future version of the Terra, as admittedly it is a little little disappointing not to see 8 GHz on the wire connectivity here. But on the plus side, the Terra's high polling rates over the wireless connectivity were very well implemented, and the 1, 2, and 4K polling rates worked flawlessly over my testing. I unfortunately wasn't able to test the 8 GHz as due to the age of my system it did not run properly, but the 2 and 4K polling rates were extremely well implemented and I didn't run into any inconsistencies or connectivity issues with them over my testing. Now, just like most ultralight mice that have released as of late, the Terra is using a 250 mAh battery, which admittedly is a surprisingly small battery. I was honestly expecting a 300 mAh battery, but a 250 mAh battery can work. Its operating life will just heavily depend on how well TEEVOLUTION's power optimizations are. Now, TEEVOLUTION is advertising that the Terra's operating time will be up to 70 hours running 1 kHz, which in all honesty is quite low compared to a lot of other mice using 250 mAh batteries. Now, testing my unit, setting the mouse's auto sleep to 40 minutes, disabling motion sync and setting the indicator LED to a solid color max brightness, and the mouse set on a jiggler set to constant motion. On 1 kHz, the Terra operated for around 67 hours. On 2 kHz, it operated for around 53 hours. On 4 kHz, it operated for 24 hours, and on 8 kHz, the Terra operated for only 16 hours. Now, keep in mind, as always, that this data is based off of constant motion as the mouse was on a jiggler set to constant motion. In normal use cases, the battery life will be a little longer as auto sleep will kick in to conserve power, and of course your mouse won't be constantly moving. But that said, it does appear as if the Terra's power optimizations are a little lacking as its operational life is on the low end compared to other mice using 250 mAh batteries. Hopefully we'll see this improved with some firmware updates in the future, but on the plus side, the mouse is actually quite serviceable and very easy to open, so you can always mod out the battery for a larger capacity one if you wanted to. Now, for software, the Terra has both local and web-based versions, which is a nice thing to see. Now, these versions are essentially the same, but there are some very small differences between these two types. Now, both versions of the software is split into 4 tabs, and the layout is roughly the same that we saw on Fantex software for their mice. Now, in the first tab, we can adjust the keybinds for the mouse's buttons, adjust the main click's debounce time, set profiles of which the mouse supports 4, import or export configurations, or factory reset the mouse, but sadly there is no key rebind option to swap the mouse's profiles, which hopefully we'll see added in the future. In the next tab, we can adjust the mouse's DPI stages, of which the Terra supports 4. You can adjust the mouse's report rate, sensor mode, LOD, the mouse's lighting effects, and you can enable or disable motion sync, angle snapping, and ripple. Now, in the local version of the software, you can adjust the color of the mouse's LED indicator in this tab as well, but in the web-based version, you can't. Next, we have a macro tab, which is pretty self-explanatory, and in the last tab, you can set the software's language, check the dongle and mouse's firmware levels, adjust the mouse's sleep timer, enable or disable long distance mode, but on the installable version you can also configure the software's boot properties. Now on the last tab here there is also a pair button which you can use to pair the mouse to the 8 GHz receiver, but I found this button only really worked via the installable software, as whenever I tried to pair the dongle via the web-based software, once you disconnected the dongle the software would close. So if you get the Terra and need to connect your mouse to the 8 GHz dongle, I'd recommend doing this via the locally installed version of the software, not the web-based version. And speaking of the dongle, let's go ahead and talk about how to pair the 8 GHz dongle. Firstly, connect the mouse via the 1 GHz dongle and download the installable version of the Terra's software. Open up the software and navigate to the last tab and click the pair button. Then hold down the left, right, and middle click buttons on the Terra until the indicator LED blinks, which means the mouse is in pairing mode. Then disconnect the 1 GHz dongle, plug in the 8 GHz dongle and press spacebar, and then space again, wait for the pairing process to complete, and that should pair the Terra to the 8 GHz dongle. Alright, and in terms of serviceability, as I mentioned earlier, the Terra is a very easy to service unit, unlike most split PCB mice, as the ribbon cables are very long, so servicing the Terra is much easier than it is on other similarly built mice. Another benefit to the split PCB design is that if a section fails, you only need to replace that part, not the entire board, which is a great feature when it comes to long-term repairability. But it's important to note that the rear shell area here does have a clip to it that holds the top and the bottom shells together, together, similar to the ones we saw in the PM1 and the Sora V2, which will likely snap when you disassemble the mouse, but thankfully this doesn't cause any creaking or flexing, so this isn't an issue per se. The only other tricky aspect when taking apart the Terra would be the base screws, as you can snap the pilot holes very easily by over-tensioning the screws, so you do need to be rather careful when you put the mouse back together, as again it's very easy to snap these pilot holes, but as long as you don't over-tension the screws you should be okay. But aside from the base screws and the rear shell clip, the Terra is a very serviceable unit on the inside, so if you need to clean, mod, or repair anything inside the mouse, it'll be quite easy to do so. And if you'd like to learn how to fully disassemble and reassemble the Terra so you can mod or clean the mouse, be sure to get subscribed so you don't miss the Terra's teardown video. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the Terra is quite unique as it includes 3 kinds of skates: the stock honeycomb ones, a full-size flat PTFE skate, and 8 smaller PTFE dots. Now, my preferred type was the flat PTFE and the dots, of course, but I wanted to talk a little bit more in depth about these honeycomb skates first. Now, these skates, as I mentioned earlier, aren't exactly my favorite, as they're essentially a PTFE skate covered in tiny hexagonal dots, which is an interesting concept on paper, but in reality, these skates' texturing sinks into pads a little bit too much, so they end up feeling much slower and more controlled than traditional flatter skates do. They do feel a little bit better on firmer pads, but in every situation I use them on, I felt like I'd be better with the flattened PTFE skates. It's also worth noting that these honeycomb skates aren't very universal in terms of their usage, as they can only be used on fabric pads, as if they're used on a hard pad, their honeycomb texture will be worn down by the hard pad surface. On the other hand though, and as I mentioned earlier, the included standard full-size PTFE skates and dot skates performed much better, but again they are made of the same softer PTFE material we saw on Fantech stock skates, so they are a little more controlled than you expect a PTFE skate to be, but they did perform well and they were much more consistent in feeling than these stock honeycomb ones. Now, personally speaking, on the next iteration of the Terra, I'd much rather see more traditional stock skates included, both in dot and full-size forms, not these honeycomb ones, but I'd also like to see the skate channels themselves changed, as currently they're very thin, much too thin for all kinds of aftermarket skates aside from dot skates, and I'd much rather see a larger half crescent skate cutout similar to the ones we saw in the X2 Crazy Light here on the Terra, as not only would larger stock skates feel better in my opinion given the mouse's size, larger skate cutouts would also make the mouse much more compatible with aftermarket skates. Alright, and lastly let's talk a little bit more about the Terra's stock cable. As I mentioned earlier, the stock cable here is a little disappointing as it's identical to the one we saw used for the Fantech Aria 2 Pro, and since it's the same cable, they have the same issues, as while the wrapping is a relatively low friction wrapping, the cable is very rigid and not very flexible, which makes using it for wired use less than ideal, and sadly the cable still doesn't have a tilted USB-C end. Thankfully though, it is thin enough to be usable with bungees, but overall its usage for wired connectivity is less than ideal. Now, since the mouse only supports 1K polling over its wired connectivity type, this cable will only really be used for charging, but if TEEVOLUTION releases a future version of the Terra that supports 8K polling via wired connectivity, I'd highly recommend that they include a more flexible cable with a tilted USB-C end. If they were to include a cable similar to the ones we saw included with the Pulsar X2 series mice, that would be perfect in my opinion. But on the plus side, while the Terra's stock cable is disappointing, its USB-C port is universal, so you can use your preferred type of aftermarket cable here on the Terra if you'd like to. Alright, well in closing, overall the TEEVOLUTION Terra is a very impressive mouse. While yes, it is a clone of the G703, TEEVOLUTION has improved so many aspects of this mouse, it doesn't feel like a clone so to speak, it feels like a totally new version of this mouse. But that said, while I love the mouse and its shape, there are several things that do need some improvements, specifically the build quality in terms of the pilot holes for the top and base shells, and the mouse's power efficiency, as well as a couple other things I talked about in this video already. But even with these issue areas, the Terra is still a very good mouse, arguably my favorite release of 2025 so far, and one that is definitely going to be staying in the mouse rotation going forward. But I will say, I'm very interested in seeing what TEEVOLUTION's next mouse will be, as no offense to them, cloning a shape is pretty easy nowadays, and I'm very interested to see how a mouse that's developed from the ground up from them would feel and perform, hopefully in addition addition to an original mouse, we'll also see an updated version of the Terra that fixes all the issues I talked about in this video, and it also supports wired AK polling rate, as that would be arguably a perfect mouse, but we'll have to wait and see what they do. But if you'd like to learn more about the TEEVOLUTION Terra or pick one up for yourself, you can check out their Indiegogo campaign, which will be linked down in the video description. But with that, that is everything for today's episode of the mel0n review. Big thanks again to TEEVOLUTION for sending over the Terra for a review. I greatly appreciate it, and big thank you to our channel members who make what I do here on the channel possible. If you didn't know, channel members get early access to all upcoming content, so if you'd like to see new episodes before anyone else, and of course support what I do here on the channel, you can become a channel member here on YouTube for only $2 Canadian a month. You can also support the channel by using code mel0n, spelled with a 0, over at Lethal Gaming Gear, Potent Gaming, and Mech Keys to save yourself a little bit off your orders and of course directly support the channel. Thanks again for watching my review of the TEEVOLUTION Terra, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the mel0n review. Peace.